I did this to Paul Newman, so
You
it's all right.
did? Oh, it's okay, okay.
right.
We did a film called King of the Gypsies together.
Of course, and you were wonderful in it.
You were...
Johnny Carson, the late-night icon of American television, the man who made the entire nation roar with laughter for 30 years. Yet behind that dazzling curtain lay a bitter truth. Carson carried in his heart a blacklist. People he hated to the core, whose very names were enough to make him flare with anger. They had embarrassed him on national television, turned The Tonight Show into a chaotic stage, and behind the spotlight many were mired in affairs, reckless egos, or self-indulgent habits that Carson utterly despised. At a private party in Malibu, he once said coldly, "They don't deserve to sit on The Tonight Show, and they don't deserve my respect." So who in the end planted such lifelong hatred in Johnny Carson? The answer lies just ahead. 1. Joan Rivers, the protege who betrayed her mentor at the peak. Johnny Carson often stressed that if any woman could inherit The Tonight Show's legacy, it was Joan Rivers. In 1965, she made her first appearance on the Burbank stage and had the audience in stitches within minutes. Carson looked into the camera and declared, "She's going to be a big star." The next day, Variety called it the biggest explosion The Tonight Show had created since the 60s. From a complete unknown, Rivers was vaulted by Carson into stardom, frequently guest hosting in his absence. In Carson's eyes, she was practically the show's favorite child. But fame changed Rivers. In 1984, on air, she poked at Carson's failed marriages, turning his private pain into a joke. The breaking point came in 1986, when Fox offered a $1 million contract, full creative control, and the title of the first female late-night host. Rivers didn't tell Carson a word, didn't even call for advice. Days later, the Los Angeles Times blared Joan Rivers signs with Fox set to rival Johnny Carson. Carson learned it from the papers, stunned. From that day, he cut her off, instructing his secretary, "Don't ever put her through to me again." To Carson, Rivers died in 1986. Worse off stage, her personal life became a string of scandals that in his eyes shattered her image. Rivers was so obsessed with plastic surgery that people dubbed her Hollywood's Queen of the Scalpel. She admitted to having undergone hundreds of procedures, from facelifts and nose jobs to liposuction, even risky operations that frightened doctors. The Guardian once jeered Joan Rivers' face changes faster than TV programming schedules. To Carson, who valued naturalness on air, she embodied fakery, something he loathed. She was also dogged by loud rumors about affairs. In Hollywood whispers, she'd had secret nights with powerful producers and even A-list leading men in exchange for opportunities. In 1983, the New York Daily News even hinted she'd been accused by a female colleague of joke theft, using her clout to push the other down. Scandals like these made industry peers keep their distance. Carson, who prized honesty on stage, felt especially insulted looking back at the protege he'd once championed. Rivers was notorious for incendiary remarks as well. In 1985, she faced a firestorm for making black people and the LGBT community the butt of jokes during a New York set. The Washington Post called it a stain on American comedy. To Carson, who had fought repeatedly to keep The Tonight Show clear of FCC probes, her courting of scandal was like spitting on the very reputation he had tried to protect. Even at home, she was painted as cold. Her daughter Melissa hinted in interviews that her mother often put career over family, frequently leaving home for the spotlight. To Carson, who valued privacy, that only deepened his disdain. The bitter end came quickly. The Late Show, starring Joan Rivers, collapsed in under a year due to dismal ratings. Rivers lost the show the contracts and Carson. But for him, the hurt wasn't her failure. It was that someone he'd treated like family could betray him and live so falsely. Among the names Carson despised, Joan Rivers holds a special place, not just a professional traitor, but a symbol of Hollywood's dark side. Arrogant, debauched, fake, and willing to sacrifice anything for the spotlight. In Carson's role of the most hated, Rivers occupies a singular spot. She wasn't a difficult guest. She was the most painful betrayal he ever endured. A wound that never healed, lasting to the end of his days. And the next figure hurt him almost as much. 2. Bob Hope, the guest Johnny Carson hated more than anyone. Johnny Carson once revealed at a private Beverly Hills party in 1982 that if there was one person he couldn't stand, it was Bob Hope. The table fell silent to the American public. Hope was untouchable. He'd made the nation proud singing for U.S. troops in World War II, starred in dozens of films, and had practically lived and died with NBC. But to Carson, Hope was a recurring stain. Every appearance felt like the soul of The Tonight Show was being stripped away. From backstage on, Hope suffocated the room. He never walked into the studio alone. He hauled in his own team of writers, clutching thick scripts, forcing Carson to read every line verbatim. Hollywood reporters called them the Hope Factory, a mass production line of soulless jokes. For Carson, who lived on improvisation, it was a slap in the face. One night in March 1978 at Burbank Studios, Carson was about to move to the interview when Hope cut in coolly, demanding they roll a clip the audience will like. The result, Tush. The Tonight Show was interrupted by a 10-minute promo for the Bob Hope Christmas special. The studio audience grew awkward. A few even whistled in protest. Carson sat rigid, twirling his pen, as if it were the only way to throttle his anger. The next day, the Los Angeles Times headlined, "The Tonight Show turned into a Bob Hope showcase," and TV Guide sneered Carson, America's biggest star, suddenly a reluctant spectator on his own stage. And Hope didn't abuse power just once. He used The Tonight Show to hawk everything Fresh Memoirs albums, Vegas tours. Once he even plopped a pair of golf shoes on the desk, saying he'd auction them for charity. The audience laughed, but Carson sat stone-faced, knowing it wasn't altruism, it was tacky promotion. The money grabs were even cruder. While most stars considered an appearance an honor, Hope demanded NBC pay at least $25,000 per spot with full control over content. Carson was so furious he slammed the table in an NBC meeting and barked, "If he didn't have someone backing him, I would have struck him from this show long ago." The killing blow, Hope casually asked Carson for a clean recording of The Tonight Show's audience laughter to insert into his own specials. To Carson, that laughter was real, the show's soul. To Hope, it was counterfeit to be manufactured. One evening at Chasen's, Carson sat with friends face flushed, grinding out, "I've never despised anyone this much." But that was just the surface. Beyond personal reasons, Hope's private life, well known to Carson, deepened his contempt. Behind the Man of America image, Hope was notorious as one of Hollywood's great womanizers. Later biographies revealed a long list of affairs from young starlets to unknown singers, some even kept in secret apartments in Los Angeles. His nearly 70-year marriage to Dolores Reed, when scrutinized, appeared to lack an official marriage certificate. Colleagues whispered Dolores was merely an honor shield, while Hope spent his life in clandestine liaisons. Worse, he was accused of being domineering, selfish, and shockingly stingy. Despite immense wealth, he often refused to support charities unless his name appeared prominently on donor boards. An early 80s Hollywood Reporter piece wrote, "Hope only does good when the cameras are pointed at him." To Carson, the national legend was a fraud, greedy fake, and debauched. The public might worship Bob Hope forever, but to Carson, he was the most detestable name of all. The man who turned The Tonight Show, his life's pride, into a hollow stage where laughter was exploited for personal gain. After that wound, the next name brought a different kind of obsession, not betrayal, not fakery, but the first time Carson felt threatened at work itself. Wayne Newton provoked to the point of storming into Carson's dressing room in 3 decades of hosting The Tonight Show. Johnny Carson had mocked countless famous figures from politicians to Hollywood stars, but only one man turned harmless jokes into a confrontation so tense the entire NBC backstage quaked. Wayne Newton, the king of Las Vegas entertainment. At first, Carson treated Newton as an easy laugh. From the late 70s on, Newton's name popped up often in the opening monologue. The studio clapped and roared. Laughter rippled through Burbank Studios. Newton initially saw it as free publicity. Then it became a nightmare as Carson kept targeting his polished looks, high-pitched voice, and even his private life. In 1980, live on air, Carson joked that Newton wears more makeup than his wife. The audience howled, but the press pounced. The Los Angeles Herald-Examiner labeled Newton Vegas's unrecognized starlet. Rolling Stone jabbed, "People can't tell whether Newton is a pop idol or a beauty queen." For a star trading on masculine allure, it was a dagger to the heart. Carson didn't stop. In 1982, he insinuated Newton was a regular at clubs ordinary men wouldn't frequent. In a still conservative America, that kind of hint shoved Newton to the wolves. He took it as a public insult to his honor and the career he'd built. Then, one autumn night in 1982, it blew up. After finishing a set at Caesar's Palace, Newton drove straight to Burbank instead of his hotel. He entered NBC with a face of steel, brushed aside security, and went directly to Carson's dressing room. People outside heard the door slam and Newton's furious voice. A staffer later said he caught words like family and children echoing in the hall. The crew turned pale. This was more than anger. It felt like a threat. Rumors spread like wildfire. Vegas reporters hinted at Newton's complicated ties to casinos and the local mafia. New York Times journalist Bill Carter commented, "That was the first time Johnny Carson realized a joke could spark a threat to his safety." Newton struck back publicly. On Call-Ass TV, he warned, "Some people only know how to live by tearing others down, but they'll pay the price." The line buzzed across Vegas from casinos to bars, further humiliating Carson. Within the industry, Newton was infamous for mounting debts. In the late 80s, he faced multi-million-dollar financial lawsuits and Nevada bank loans. Some papers even hinted he leaned on Vegas underworld ties to prop up his career. There were also waves of rumor about affairs, whispers of private parties in Vegas circles, tabloid hints from the National Enquirer. The glittering king of Las Vegas on stage was shadowed by tales of hedonism, debt, and a temper primed to explode. All of it made Carson despise him more than ever. After the clash, Carson changed. He banned Newton's name from monologues and cut Vegas jokes. At Beverly Hills parties, the mere mention of Newton turned him silent, his face like ice. A close colleague remarked, "Johnny could rib a president without a shake." But when Newton's name came up, he froze. George Carlin, the comedian who terrified Carson with censor baiting. The fourth name on the list was George Carlin. Johnny Carson once told friends in Malibu, "Some guests annoy me, but one man kept me up at night." That was George Carlin, the comedian who turned laughter into a weapon and The Tonight Show into a minefield Carson never knew when would blow. Carson was used to absolute control, every joke, every beat carefully measured. Carlin was different. He walked on looking scruffy, long hair, beard-piercing eyes, and delivered blunt surgical satire. Sirens blared in Carson's head one misstep, and the FCC would call, advertisers would flee, and NBC would pin the blame on him. This wasn't paranoia. In 1972, Carlin shocked the nation with 7 dirty words you can never say on television. Minutes after performing, Milwaukee police arrested him. The case escalated to FCC v. Pacifica Foundation, ending in 1978 when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled broadcasters could regulate indecent language. Carlin's name became synonymous with scandal and The Tonight Show. The biggest late-night platform became the most dangerous place to seat him. NBC prepared an emergency plan whenever Carlin appeared. In the control room, the cut-to-commercial button sat ready. Editors' hands trembled. One staffer recalled, "It felt like waiting for a bomb to go off. We all knew one wrong word and everything would collapse." Carson smiled on camera, but inside he wrestled with anger and dread. Carlin was too smart, too sharp, and crucially uncontrollable. One minute he charmed with a whimsical story, the next he'd skewer the White House or the Pope. Carson hated that feeling on his own stage, staking his career on someone else's mouth. He hated even more that Carlin used drugs, weed, and more, and openly bragged about being high before audiences. Colleagues called Carlin a rebel soul. To Carson, he dragged comedy through the mud, using art as a pretext to flaunt vice. Over time, Carson chose to make Carlin disappear from The Tonight Show. From a favored regular in the 60s, Carlin was nearly erased in the 80s. But Carson never forgot. A colleague once heard him sigh, "Some people make you mad and you forget. But George Carlin, he left me with a fear I could never shake." In Carson's blacklist, Carlin stands out for that reason. He didn't just annoy Carson, he made the king of late night feel like he was sitting on a grenade with the pin pulled. Yet Carlin was only part of the story. The next name gave Carson a different headache. A legendary superstar so brazen, he would stride onto the national stage and seize the spotlight right in front of Carson while millions watched live. 5. Frank Sinatra, the swaggering superstar who cut off Carson on air. Backstage at NBC Burbank, November 1976, the usual rhythm. Carson straightened his tie. The crew readied the cameras, the audience primed for the first applause. Minutes later, the taping descended into a chaos Carson would never forget. The culprit, Frank Sinatra. As Carson launched into political barbs, Sinatra suddenly walked out from the wings. No notice, no introduction, just a whiskey glass in hand and a cocky grin. Cameras swung toward him. The audience erupted as if welcoming America's true sovereign. In that instant, Carson was shoved aside, watching the show bearing his name turn into Sinatra's private performance. What was supposed to be a quick hello became nearly 5 minutes of Vegas tour stories, private jokes, and a few bars of My Way. The crowd went wild while Carson stood there, a guest at his own party. The next morning, the Los Angeles Times headlined, "The Tonight Show becomes the Sinatra Show." For Carson, it was a spear to the heart, his stage hijacked for the first time. And that was just the surface. Every Sinatra appearance sent NBC into a tailspin. He brought his notorious entourage, bodyguards, drinking buddies, Rat Pack pals. The hallways turned into a Vegas nightclub, cigar smoke hanging thick, raucous laughter drowning out call times. Carson often had to delay taping by dozens of minutes just to indulge Sinatra. For a man obsessed with professionalism, it was humiliation. Offstage, Sinatra's private life only deepened Carson's contempt. Everyone knew of his mafia ties, reports of backing from Chicago boss Sam Giancana, whispers that he leaned on underworld connections to secure Vegas contracts. His love life was notorious too. A parade of young lovers flanked him even into his 60s, from Ava Gardner and Mia Farrow to anonymous beauties painting a portrait of a man who refused to live quietly. Add a violent temper throwing chairs at reporters, slapping waiters for less than icy drinks, and to Carson, Sinatra wasn't a legend, but a symbol of arrogance and chaos. Years later in retirement, Carson sipped a drink during an interview and said, almost offhand, "Some people walk right over you even while you're talking. That's when you know you never want to see them again." He didn't need to name names. Hollywood knew he meant Frank Sinatra. Tom Snyder, a guest who acted like he owned the show. The sixth person on the list is Tom Snyder. By the late 1970s, Tom Snyder had become a sensation with NBC's Tomorrow Show. He was known for his blunt, icy delivery and his constant need to control the conversation. But that habit of holding the reins turned into a nightmare whenever Snyder appeared on The Tonight Show. From his very first time in 1978, Carson sensed trouble. Snyder didn't sit still like a typical guest. He rattled on, endlessly interrupted constantly, and steered the talk toward television's backstage. Carson tried repeatedly to cut in, but failed. The audience sometimes laughed at his glibness, but the tension in Carson's eyes was impossible for the cameras to miss. In 1979, the Los Angeles Times snarked. Johnny Carson looked like a guest on his own show that night. Snyder turned The Tonight Show into an extension of Tomorrow Show. For Carson, it was a stain that wouldn't wash out. Snyder didn't stop. He also exploited The Tonight Show as a PR tool. In 1980 on air, he brazenly told viewers to switch over to Tomorrow Show after midnight. The whole studio was stunned. Carson kept a strained smile, but everyone knew he was boiling inside. NBC's backstage filled with complaints. Staffers recalled that after each Snyder visit, Carson would slam his dressing room door and mutter that Snyder had no concept of basic courtesy. Those were the professional reasons Carson hated Snyder. But his contempt multiplied when he looked at Snyder's shadowy private life. Snyder was known as a heavy drinker. More than once, he went on Tomorrow Show with a flushed face and offbeat speech. The New York Daily News once revealed he had to grip a cup of thick coffee to mask the alcohol on his breath, though colleagues nearby still smelled whiskey. In television, that's taboo. To Carson, obsessed with on-air polish, Snyder's disregard for discipline only deepened the disdain. Beyond drinking, Snyder was infamous for stormy interviews thanks to his combative attitude. He once tangled with John Lennon and was criticized for attacking the guest instead of conversing. Another time, interviewing actor Chevy Chase, Snyder interrupted so much that Chase snapped at him on air. The press called it a television accident, but Snyder wore it like a trophy. That arrogance made Carson despise him even more. Snyder's private life was just as scandalous. He divorced twice and was rumored to have affairs with women decades younger. In the early 80s, people hinted he had a list of partners longer than the guest list of Tomorrow Show. Around NBC, some whispered that Snyder leveraged his position to trade career opportunities for romantic favors. Though never proven, the rumors spread quickly and clung to his image like a shadow. To Carson, all of that formed the perfect figure to loathe arrogant in the job a mess in private. He once said at a Beverly Hills party, "Every time Snyder sits in that chair, I know I'm going to lose both the laughs and the respect." And if Snyder made Carson weary by steamrolling the room, the next figure sent chaos skyrocketing. This time it was a female writer who drained Carson every time he had to face her on The Tonight Show stage. Jefferson Norman Mailer, the writer who turned talk shows into philosophical brawls. Across 3 decades, Johnny Carson spoke with presidents, Hollywood stars, and towering intellectuals. But one name made him frown every time: Norman Mailer. To audiences, Mailer was a great writer, the author of The Naked and the Dead, a 2-time Pulitzer winner. To Carson, Mailer wasn't a literary genius. He was the man who turned The Tonight Show into a heavy philosophy class that smothered the room. At his first appearance in 1980, Carson lobbed a light question about contemporary American literature. Instead of a crisp answer, Mailer dragged the talk into the Vietnam War imperialism, then suddenly veered into gender equality. At first, the audience listened. Within minutes, many were yawning, whispering, "Is this really The Tonight Show?" Carson sat taut as a wire and had to hurriedly cue the crew to cut to commercials. Carson's dislike wasn't just about being long-winded. Offstage, Mailer carried a scandal-soaked private life Hollywood always buzzed about. He was known as a heavy drinker and repeatedly appeared drunk in interviews. Once on PBS, Mailer swayed and stumbled over his words so badly that a journalist gently asked, "Are you sure you're on the right program?" To Carson, who was obsessed with professionalism, a repeat of that on The Tonight Show would be humiliating. Worse, Mailer was infamous for his temper and violence. In 1960, at a New York party, he stabbed his wife, Adele Morales, sending her to the hospital. The press exploded. The New York Times called it a shock to America's intellectual circles. Though Adele survived, Mailer's image was forever tied to domestic violence. In Carson's eyes, a man who preached ethics on air while having stabbed his wife was shameless hypocrisy, and Mailer's love life was chaotic. He married 6 times and had countless flings with women much younger. People once joked that Mailer's little black book is thicker than his bibliography. Hollywood buzzed that he bragged about one-night stands in Greenwich Village bars, flaunting them as macho trophies. To Carson, who detested swagger and hypocrisy, that was more than enough to rank Mailer among his least favorite guests. Add his arrogant interview habit, putting others down to assert his higher intellect, and Mailer repeatedly left The Tonight Show in awkward knots. Carson later said at a Beverly Hills party, "Whenever Mailer sits down, I know I'll lose the laughs and go home with a headache." If Mailer suffocated The Tonight Show by turning it into a pointless philosophical sparring match, the next figure exhausted Carson in a completely different way, a loud, impulsive Hollywood actress who loved to wreak havoc on stage and seize the spotlight at any cost. Shelley Winters, the impulsive actress who took off her shoe and handed it to Carson on air. Johnny Carson was famous for patience and a masterful knack for on-air improvisation. Yet even he often winced at one guest who never sat still, Shelley Winters. A 2-time Oscar winner beloved across America for iconic roles, she seemed to forget she was a guest the moment she stepped onto The Tonight Show, acting as if the entire program existed just for her. From the early 70s, whenever NBC announced a taping with Winters, the crew groaned. Carson would ask about her new film. She would casually cut him off to recount an old romance with Marlon Brando. When he tried to guide the audience to a story's payoff, Winters would pull a stack of clippings from her handbag and read unrelated news aloud. The studio laughed at the surprise. Carson kept a strained smile to mask his irritation. The peak came in 1975. In the middle of a passionate complaint about Hollywood's unfair pay for actresses, Winters suddenly removed a high heel and placed it directly into Carson's hand in front of millions. Laughter erupted, but Carson sat frozen, his face flushing with embarrassment. The next day, the Los Angeles Times sneered. Last night, The Tonight Show wasn't a talk show. It became a one-woman act called Shelley Winters, with Johnny Carson reduced to the props guy. But the on-air antics were only part of what made Carson dislike her. What truly grated was how Winters' complicated, chaotic private life spilled into the interview chair. She was notorious for partying and brawling while drunk at Oscar gatherings. People once reported she staggered out of the Beverly Hills Hotel, shouting in the lobby and throwing the place into turmoil. Hearing it, Carson only shook his head. "She brings her party habits into my studio." Winters' romantic record was as long as her filmography. From brief affairs with Marlon Brando and Errol Flynn to rumors involving powerful MGM directors, she carried a reputation for shocking with bedroom tales more than with acting. More than once on The Tonight Show, she slipped into those stories, confusing the audience and forcing Carson to cut to commercials. She also had a habit of drinking on air. Once she brought a small bottle of vodka, poured a glass, and downed it while Carson was still trying to ask about her new movie. The studio tilted. The audience buzzed, and Carson sat in one of his most awkward moments. A backstage NBC staffer said Johnny hates chaos. With Shelley, he never knew what would happen. One night she takes off a shoe, another night she drinks another, she curses out Hollywood. To Johnny, she was a nightmare. What wore Carson down most was Winters' lack of boundaries. Even when the audience pushed back, she kept turning the talk show into a public therapy session, venting about cheating husbands or roles she didn't get. To Carson, The Tonight Show was a place for viewers to end a long day with laughter. But whenever Winters showed up, it became a live counseling hour with a star unloading on everyone. Gradually, Carson all but avoided her. When NBC had to book her for film promotion, he nodded it through but was ready to flare up at any moment. In his eyes, Winters embodied chaos, impulsive, loud, mired in endless scandals, and utterly out of control. After Shelley Winters' chaotic appearances, Carson thought he'd reached his limit. But another star would exhaust him in a wholly different way, a haughty newcomer who turned every conversation into a showcase of luxe living, pushing The Tonight Show away from its natural ease. Chevy Chase, the cocky young star who made Carson feel his throne was being eyed. In the mid-70s, Johnny Carson still sat firmly on late night's throne. His Tonight Show was Hollywood's golden gateway, the stage every star longed to grace. Then, from Saturday Night Live, a young face broke out and caused a storm. Chevy Chase. In just one first season, Chase was hailed as the new gentleman of American comedy, landing cover after cover from Rolling Stone to Time. To Carson, it was a bad sign. From his very first Tonight Show appearance in 1975, Chase rubbed Carson the wrong way. Instead of the respect due a senior statesman, he lounged back, answered loosely, and often ignored questions to face the audience and do a clumsy chair fall, the SNL bit that made him famous. The studio roared. Carson gripped the mic with a thin smile. He saw it instantly. This young man hadn't come to talk, he'd come to test a power grab. Just 3 years later, in 1978, Chase sparked an uproar at a Burbank taping. When Carson mentioned SNL's success, hoping for some fun backstage anecdotes, Chase boasted, "We're doing things the old generation would never dare." The room fell silent. Carson awkwardly changed the subject. Variety wrote the next day, Chevy Chase didn't show up to be guided by Carson, he came to declare himself the future. It struck Carson's pride hard. He was sensitive to anyone eyeing his powerful chair. NBC's halls buzzed. One staffer recalled, every time Chevy left the studio, Johnny would slam his dressing room door and sit in silence. He couldn't stand that center of the universe attitude. The discomfort wasn't only on stage. Offstage, Carson found Chase even more detestable as Hollywood scandals spread. The press painted Chase as a star who grew arrogant fast. Rolling Stone wrote about all-night parties in the Hollywood Hills, where he got drunk, spewed profanity, and even fought with friends. In 1981, the New York Post revealed many SNL colleagues shunned him for a nasty temperament, belittling writers and openly mocking co-stars. Comedian Gilda Radner lamented to friends that working with Chevy Chase is like walking a tightrope. You're always afraid he'll shove you off. There were also rumors of whirlwind romances, one-night stands scattered across Hollywood. Paparazzi often caught Chase leaving hotels at dawn with different models. To Carson, a brash young star who misbehaved on air and off only cemented his contempt. Audiences weighed in too. NBC received piles of letters, some praised his boldness, but many complained that Chase disrespected the host. One letter reprinted in the New York Post read, "I tune into The Tonight Show to laugh with Carson, not to watch some kid try to prove he's obsolete." By the early 80s, the Carson-Chase relationship had nearly frozen. Once Chase arrived almost half an hour late, drunk after a party, then took the stage just to plug a new movie. For Carson, it was the last straw. He no longer saw Chase as a guest, but as a would-be usurper. But Johnny Carson left behind a legendary Tonight Show, but he also left a bitter blacklist few could have imagined. The legends and superstars no one dared to touch were precisely the ones who made him lose faith and lose that famed composure. So, what do you think? Among all these figures who made Carson suffer the most, or is there another name you believe he secretly despised? Leave a comment below so we can discuss. And if you want to keep uncovering Hollywood's most shocking backstage secrets, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss any upcoming video.